Okay, like last time, this is not going to be a straightforward lecture. For most of the time, we shall take up some cases, and we hope to be discussing those cases. And at the end of the cases, we hope to have some conclusions about how to deal with cases of that sort. Okay? And since this is about integrity and scientific misconduct, I start again by giving some examples just to illustrate the types of misconduct that have been committed. And this one is a little bit funny. I think not just a little bit funny, because it's so ridiculous to believe that something like this could be perpetrated among the scientific community. Okay? In this particular case of the patchwork mouse, William Summerlin announced sometime in 1973 that he had succeeded in grafting tissue from one organism to another. So one mouse to another mouse, actually from the skin of one mouse to the skin of another mouse. And his finding was, as he announced, that the tissue that was to be transplanted should be placed in a particular culture medium. In other words, he was saying, okay, this is one mouse, this is another mouse, and I want to transplant the skin from this mouse to this other mouse, and my research has something to do with the culture medium. So I take one piece, one patch of skin from one mouse, and this is a particular culture medium that I have developed. Provided that I put this patch of skin in this culture medium before I transfer it to the other mouse, then it will work. Okay? So it's like if we were mice, you can take a part of my skin and then put it in a culture medium and transfer it to, say, Daniel's skin, and it will work. It will attach to his body because of that particular culture medium. In this case, presumably from a black mouse to a white mouse. But these mice that he presented were actually white mice just decorated with a black felt tip pen, the ordinary pen that you use for marking. And it wasn't until the following year that he was exposed by his colleagues. So that's just to start off our presentation for tonight. We have taken up these other examples last time. Well, now that the slide is there, I can narrate a biographical reference to Wang Wusuk. Wang Wusuk, as we mentioned previously, is a South Korean scientist who was so well funded by the South Korean government. And he had such huge funding that, well, because he was successful before the fraudulent research, he had succeeded in cloning a dog. The dog was named Snappy. And so he was so loved by the South Korean government that they gave him a lot of funding, and the South Koreans all almost adored him. And before this fraud was exposed, I was at that time vice president of the UNESCO International Bioethics Committee. And sometime during that period, I was invited to South Korea to sit in a panel together with him, to discuss the ethical issues relating to his work. I had no idea then that his research was fraudulent. So I got on a plane, and while I was on this flight, on a Korean Airlines flight, I saw at some point that there was news flash on the screen, you know, where they show movies. Instead of a movie, they were showing a news clip. And this news clip was about Wang Wusok. And they were showing that news persons had been doing some investigation. And in the news clips, they were saying all these unpatriotic newsmen, they're doing so much damage to science and to the integrity of South Korea. Why should they do this? But actually, he had been exposed already. And the symposium that I had gone there to attend didn't materialize because he didn't want to appear in public anymore. But even if he didn't want to appear in public, there were long queues of women in the hospital, in the laboratory where he worked. And these women were women who wanted to volunteer their eggs. They wanted to volunteer their eggs because one of the unethical practices of Wang Wusuk, for which he was criticized, was that he had used eggs taken from his junior collaborators. In other words, he in his laboratory had some junior scientists who were women, and some of the eggs that he used, because he had to use hundreds of eggs for the experiment, some of the eggs that he used came from the junior researchers. And South Korea had by then a law consistent with ethical standards that you can't use junior researchers as volunteers because they would be coerced to participate. Okay? So he was criticized, and people were pointing out, you did wrong by using the eggs from your women researchers. But because of that, what did the public do? The public said, oh, why do you criticize our hero for doing that? So they were queuing outside the laboratory saying, well, if they can't get those eggs from the junior researchers, take our eggs. And you have long lines of women queuing to volunteer their own eggs. Okay? Of course, you can imagine donating your egg. It's not just it's not like you're bringing eggs from the market and giving them in tribute to this person. No, it involves a process that is not exactly easy. Okay. But anyway, he was exposed not just for taking advantage of the junior researchers, but for being fraudulent in other respects. That is, for making statements that are not actually reflective of what happened in the laboratory. Okay. There was deception of the scientific community and of the public at large. But we will skip these. We will skip these slides. And what I want to show you next. Can you read the? Okay. This table is from, I think, Nature, the journal Nature, and it shows top 10 behaviors. Actually, these are misconduct, forms of misconduct that scientists declared they have engaged in. Okay, so they sent questionnaires to scientists in the United States, and they asked the scientists to indicate whether they had, sometime in the past 3 years, committed some of these forms of misconduct. What I want to call your attention to at this time is number 10, Because you remember one of the things we talked about was conflict of interest. And in number 10, it says that changing the design, methodology, or results of a study in response to pressure from a funding source. Okay, we talked about financial conflicts of interest, and you can see in the middle, at the bottom, okay, at the last line in the middle, 20.6%. That's the percentage of mid-career scientists. Mid-career meaning they're not just new, they've been in research for at least 9 years, I think, at that time. So they were in the business for at least 9 years, and 1 out of every 5 scientists said that they have engaged in changing the design, the methodology, or results of a study in order to fit what the sponsor of a study wanted to see in the research. Now, that's a big number. When 1 out of every 5 scientists does that in order to comply with what the funders anticipate, and especially if you're talking about drugs, for example, okay, that makes you so uncomfortable about the validity or the efficacy of drugs that you're taking. Because what are the funded researches? The pharmaceutical companies, for example, they are the ones that fund a lot of research because they are the ones who have to show that the drugs that they sell are effective. Okay? So if they are the ones who pay a lot for research, and 1 out of every 5 scientists does this, what does that tell us about the drugs that we take? That these are not so reliable? 1 out of every 5 is a huge number. Then there are other forms of scientific misconduct that have been found also to be remarkable, to be worrisome. Worrisome because, again, you have high rates. One, I call your attention to items 12 to 16, and you see that among mid-career scientists, the level of engagement in this kind of misconduct is at least 10%. Actually, the lowest is 12%. So that's more than 1 in 10. So that's a lot of misconduct having to do with authorship, and we will deal with a lot of authorship issues later on. So if you have any questions at any point, please just, yes.
I'm just quite curious about numbers, because why they're compared to their mid-career and early careers, their mid-careers number is actually higher than their early careers. What's the point?
Well, we don't know, but it makes us worry, doesn't it? Yes. It seems that as the scientists become more senior, they tend to commit more of the misconduct. I'm glad you noticed that because I was actually going to show this next slide precisely to emphasize that. Overall, 33% of the respondents, that's overall, that means including mid-career and early career professionals. 33%, that means 1 out of every 3 respondents said they had engaged in at least one of the top 10 behaviors, okay, during the previous 3 years. And among mid-career respondents, this proportion was 38%. So 38 out of every 100 scientists who were asked said they had committed some kind of misconduct in the last 3 years. Okay. Now, there's some other things that we can gauge from these figures. One is because the questionnaires were sent by mail, and I think the response rate was about 50%. Okay. If you receive a questionnaire asking you to check somewhere if you have committed a misconduct, okay, if you have actually committed a misconduct, what will you tend to do? Return the questionnaire with your tick, with your answer, or just forget about it? What are you more likely to do? If you're afraid of being found out, then you just throw it in the garbage can, right? You don't return it, because if you return it, the investigators might know from your handwriting or from the address where this response came from that you're the one that sent it, right? So if you're afraid of being caught, that means you don't return the questionnaire, right? There is better or higher likelihood that you won't return it. So among the 50% who did not return, there must have been more who actually committed misconduct. So the figures must be higher than this. Okay. So what I'm saying, and I realized this just when I was looking at the figures myself, we're not exactly in a community where we can be so overly confident of the work that scientists are doing. Okay. Sorry, I'm skipping through slides. And I'm jumping from different parts of this presentation. Okay. Now, it doesn't mean that the authorities are not doing anything. Okay? Misconduct has been going on, but this is from the United States, and where they have an Office of Research Integrity. What is the Office of Research Integrity doing? Well, it investigates cases, but at the end of an investigation, they do not just keep quiet about the result of the investigation. They publish on the web the results of the investigations. Okay? So in this case, this is just one. If you go to the website, you'll see that there are actually many cases. And I took just this one example. So if you were a scientist and you are found out, I mean, it is established that you have committed some misconduct, you might find your name on the internet, on the web page of the Office of Research Integrity, like this. So if you were Roxana Gonzalez, for example, you will find your name here on the internet, and they tell you, they tell everybody what you have done. They tell everybody that you are a graduate student from the Department of Social and Decision Sciences and Psychology of, I forgot the meaning of CMU, which university, engaged in scientific misconduct in research, and they give the grant that you used, the name of the grant that you used, and they itemize the kinds of misconduct that you did. That in this research, you altered the main dependent variable, you changed some data. Okay. So very specific listing of the things that you did, and the kind of punishment that they impose. that as a result of that, she was to be excluded from serving in any capacity for a period of 3 years, that any institution that submits an application must concurrently submit a plan for supervision of your duties. Okay? So if you committed a misconduct, they will say, well, if you want to hire her, then you must show in your proposal how you intend to use her and how you intend to make sure that she is not going to commit the same misconduct again. Okay. Would you like to find your name in the internet like that? Obviously not. So it's not as if the authorities are not doing anything, but still it seems that the motivation to be committing some kinds of misconduct is there. Okay. Now we move on to another case. This time we have a case that we want to look at. This is about testing a microbicide. A microbicide is something that you use in order to protect a woman from HIV or other sexually transmitted disease or infection. At the time of this study, there was a growing consensus among experts that a vaginal microbicide could offer women the potential to protect themselves from HIV and other sexually transmitted infections. Okay. Phase 1 testing in 5 countries showed that the agent produced no clinically significant signs of irritation. Okay. Phase 1 testing means to see if there was some harm that could occur as a use of the microbicide. And the researchers designed a next phase trial, a phase 2 trial with 300 participants to further assess the safety and efficacy of the product. Okay. So phase 1 testing was completed already. Phase 2 means more participants, more human subjects. So this one with 300 participants to assess the safety and efficacy. So it's not just the safety, but also the efficacy. Will it actually work? First large-scale trial in a population of women who were not sex workers. Okay, so these were not going to be sex workers. A favorite subject of experiments like this are the women sex workers, because they're the ones who are exposed to this kind of infection very much. Okay? So this was not to be about sex workers. And this was not one of the microbicides that also works as a contraceptive. Okay? So not a contraceptive, just a microbicide. Now, one non-governmental organization, the Power to Women International, funded renovations at 2 clinics used to upgrade lab facilities. That was to support this research. They also hired nursing and support staff for the study. And before the study started, their researchers and their local counterparts held meetings to explain the study to potential participants. Okay, so it seems that they were doing everything in order, properly, in order to prepare the study. So who were to be included in the study? Women, at least 18 years of age, negative for HIV, and resident in the community for at least 1 year. The researchers did not seek informed consent from the women's partners. Okay? So no consent from women partners. Women were neither encouraged nor discouraged to inform their partners. Okay? So this was about a microbicide for sexually transmitted infections. Of course, the transmission of infections takes place when there is a partner. Okay? But the women were considered as the primary subjects of the investigation, but the male partners were not to be contacted about giving consent. Okay, there are other details here. So you can imagine how the males might get involved. Okay? This does not involve the males because self-applied gel or placebo, okay, 3 times weekly, monthly clinic visits to check for irritation and test for sexually transmitted infections, safe sex counseling, free condoms, treatment for STIs or sexually transmitted infections in case some were discovered. And there was to be modest monetary compensation for time and transport. Okay. So if you have something like that, the question is, should the investigators have sought informed consent from partners? Is it necessary, do you think, when you have an investigation like that, to involve or to get informed consent from partners? Let me give you a further background. Among women or women's groups in many countries, there is a thinking that the woman, as much as possible, should be seen as being independent from the male partner. In other words, well, there are some practices that would treat the woman as not being equal. For example, in some Muslim countries, if you were to ask a woman to fill up a questionnaire, you cannot do that with just the woman alone. There has to be the husband at the same time, okay? Especially in matters of reproductive health. Okay? Did you get the point? The woman is not seen as being an independent individual. Always there must be the consent of the partner. Okay? So this case is different in that it seeks to establish the independence of the woman and to treat her independently outside, as it were, of the partnership. You get the point? The problem, however, is that in this particular case, it involves behavior that the woman cannot perform alone. Obviously, if the woman is to engage in a sexual act, it has to be with a partner. Okay? So the significance of the question, should investigators have sought informed consent from partners? Is there a reason, you think, to involve the partners here?
I think yes, because this investigation must include not only the women, but also their partner. So I think it's necessary for for the investigator to ask the consent from your partner, because the researches include both of them. The investigation includes both of them. So it's necessary to ask their consent.
Okay, let's test that assertion that the investigation involves both of them. Okay, the idea is to test if the microbicide is safe and effective. Okay, if the idea is to test whether the microbicide is safe and effective, then what you do is to apply it to the woman and see what the result is going to be.
The research include the action between the women and their partner. So even though the main research purpose is for the microbicide, but however the whole research process must be through their partner and also the women. So I think it's necessary to get the consent from the partner.
Okay, who thinks otherwise? Is there anyone who thinks otherwise?
Professor, I want to know that if the treatment will be offered when these women actually know that they have the disease or they
Yes, yes.
Because before they gather the investigation, I think women should have their own rights to disclosure or not to their partners. And then when the process goes through, then they actually know that they are get the disease, then these women have the rights to disclose to their partner. But the informed consent is, I don't know in what phase they will be conducted. So maybe you can explain more.
The stipulation was that if sexually transmitted infections were discovered, then the sexually transmitted infections were going to be treated. Okay. One might say that even if the research were not being done, the partners will still be partners, right? In other words, they're not just being partners for the purpose of this research. They are partners as such, whether there is the research or not. Is that good reason to say, therefore, you don't need to tell the partner beforehand? I mean, how would the partner be affected by the knowledge or by giving or not giving the consent if they were partners already before the decision to go into the research? Do you get the point? But it's not necessarily a valid point. I mean, I'm just throwing the reasoning there. So there are arguments one way or the other, right? On the one hand, you have the argument for independence on the part of women. On the other hand, you have the argument for protecting a person from the possible effects of involvement in research. And you were saying, well, it seems that the argument for informed consent is weighty, right? It has a lot of weight. and it must be ensured at all times. I mean, as a matter of principle, if someone were to be involved in research, whether as a subject directly or someone who participates in the research procedure, then he must be informed and he must give consent first. All right?
I think it's a basic principle, right? Because I'm even familiar with the scientist's procedure of doing the research, but according to my field, the legal field, we must be get the consent from our client or everything from our research, to get their consent from everything. If we want to do the further research or want to represent them, it's very important for us to get their consent.
Yes, yes indeed. Okay, so the basic principle there is informed consent, and informed consent must be taken whether someone is intended to be the direct research subject or as a participant in research in some secondary way. Okay? In other words, you're not intending to be getting data about the male partner, but it doesn't matter that you do not intend to get data about the male partner. What is important is that he will somehow be participating in experimental procedure, as you said. Okay? Any more questions on that example? Okay. I will be jumping to another example, this time involving genetic testing. Okay. Okay, this is about Otzi the Iceman. Have you heard of Otzi the Iceman? Otzi the Iceman, well, the Otzi the Iceman was found somewhere in the Alps a few years ago. He was dead already, of course, when he was found. And scientists have studied him exhaustively, both inside and out, okay? Taking samples of his teeth, bones, tissue, and intestinal contents. For almost, this is how some people have described what has been done to him. For almost 20 years, scientists have poked, prodded, incised, and x-rayed his 5,000-year-old body. And they know, for example, that he was about 46 years old. Okay, I just want to make sure you get the significance of that. That this is a 5,000-year-old body. Okay? So when he was found, this was 5,000 years old after. But they could say that he was about 46 years old when he died. He was about 5 feet 2 inches, 110 pounds, and infested with whipworm. He had 57 tattoos on his body. Imagine they also could tell after 5,000 years that the last meal included venison and bread. So you must be a very interesting person that scientists will do what they can to find out these things about you. Okay? And we are impressed by a research like that, aren't we? I mean, that's impressive research, isn't it? And do we think of something that might be wrong with what scientists are doing? Far from it. Right? Especially if you think of the other conclusions that they have drawn, that this is the oldest complete human mitochondrial DNA sequence generated to date. He belongs to a branch of mitochondrial DNA line that has not yet been identified in modern Europeans. Okay? The mitochondrial DNA is the DNA found in the mitochondria. You're familiar with the distinction between the nuclear DNA. In each cell you have the nucleus, and the nucleus contains most of the DNA that you want to study. But outside the nucleus you have the mitochondria, and the mitochondrial DNA is passed on from women, okay, because this is found in the eggs. Now, as yet, no one can claim to be a descendant of Utsi. Okay? That's impressive knowledge, isn't it? Because when you find someone so old, and you, especially if you resided in the vicinity, you'd probably be interested to know, oh, is he one of my forefathers? Okay? But they have not found anybody who is a descendant of Utsi. So that's impressive knowledge. And they have studied other things about him. And the scientists who have been studying Utsi, the Iceman, feel that a study of the complete genome of this person will enable a hunt for his modern-day relatives, and also study how certain diseases such as cancer and diabetes have mutated over the millennia. What I'm trying to show here is that, well, you have something a body that we consider sacred usually, right? If you were to die right now, you would expect to be treated as a sacred body, okay? And you don't want other people to be just poking into the inside of your body, right? Or do you not mind that at all? I mean, you have to get a special permission for, for an autopsy. Okay, unless you have a crime, then you cannot have an autopsy. Or if you want to do an autopsy, you have to get special permission. Right? If you were buried already, suppose you were buried and not cremated, and someone needed to find out something about you, then your body might be exhumed. And if your body were to be exhumed, then again, permission has to be sought. Okay, so that's how we consider the body, how important we consider it to be. But in this case, you see that a lot of scientists have been poking into his body, trying to discover as much as they can. Maybe we don't realize how important it is because Utsi is not someone we know other than as a cadaver who was found in the icy mountains, right? But suppose the person that you refer to is not Utsi, but somebody like a former president of the United States, okay? Someone who was known as the powerful advocate of liberty, the third president of the United States. He was known for drafting the U.S. Declaration of Independence. He succeeded Benjamin Franklin as minister to France. So someone so important to the Americans as a champion of freedom of speech, assembly, and practice of religion. Okay? But one of the things that we also know about him was that there was an effort for paternity and lineage testing, because even during his presidency, James Callender claimed that Jefferson kept as his concubine one of his own slaves, and that he had several children by her. Okay? So you have someone who was president of the United States, someone who was known for so many accomplishments. Now, so many years later, more than 100 years later, as a matter of fact, someone wants to prove that he fathered a child by one of his Negro slaves. What do you think that would have done to his reputation? What about the concept of privacy and the confidentiality of genetic information? Do you think someone, or do you think that it was the right thing to do? Oh, sorry. Sally is the Negro slave whom people had alleged she was the mother of one of Benjamin Franklin's, no, not Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson's children. She was one of the slaves. Because during that time, it was a practice that whites could have black slaves. Okay? I mean, the point is, would it have been appropriate to prevent a study like that, a research like that, into the background of a former president? Or can we look at this case as something similar to Utsi, the Iceman? If in the case of Utsi, the Iceman, we gave vent to our scientific curiosity as a people, could one also say in the case of Thomas Jefferson, oh, but that's part of scientific curiosity, scientific research, and there must be a freedom to conduct scientific research in search of knowledge that could be useful to settle a question once and for all? Or is this one of those occasions where we say, no, this is one of those things that tell us you have to stop right there?
So we know that in Utsi's case, nobody claims that he is the offspring of in this case, does anyone who claim that he is the offspring of Jefferson?
Oh, what do you mean? What do you mean by that? That there is an important distinction between the case of Utsi and the case of Jefferson, because there is a claim in the case of Jefferson that there was a paternity, and we treat as important issues of paternity. Is that what you're saying? That issues of paternity are covered by privacy laws. Can we say that? Can you cite a law in Taiwan that says the privacy must be protected in cases in questions of paternity unless whatever?
In Taiwan civil law, that every children should have the right to know that his real
His genetic father.
and also my mother is already know that.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. So if someone discovers that he is a child by in vitro fertilization, can he say, I want to know who my genetic father is? Yes.
It's the right to know the right to know the true parents are already regulated in our city.
In the law. Okay. Okay, so if that were the case, then if this were a Taiwanese case, then you can probably invoke this law and say, if a claim were made by, what about the descendants? Suppose it is not the child, but a grandchild or a great-grandchild. Would the same still apply? Or am I raising questions that you're not prepared to answer? Or maybe that's not covered in the law. The law did not anticipate.
I guess only father and child.
Oh, only father and child, not grandchild.
I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to. If you want to bring the case to the court, you have to bring the evidence to the court firstly. Like you have to prove you have the relation with that guy you claim as your father. And for example, like he will pay you every month for your tuition fee or your life expense. Then you can have very basic evidence that you can ask the court to recognize he as your genetic father or the father effect.
Okay. In any case, it's interesting to see what the various arguments are in a case of this sort. On the one hand, you have the argument from the sacredness of the person, meaning, well, he was a president after all, and you don't want to just do something that will tend to put a scar in the memory that you have of a former president, especially a respected former president. On the other hand, you cite also the right of the child to know who the father was. That might be related to support, but not necessarily, right? It might be related to the right of the child to demand support from the father. But aside from that, there might be another reason, which is just to know who the father really is. But if it is on the latter, on the grounds of the latter, then it stands to reason that that will apply not just to know who the father is, but to know who the real grandfather is, because that determines also the identity of the father, right? I mean, it's not just who fathered me, but where the lineage goes and how far it goes. Okay? But that might not be covered by the law. It doesn't matter for, yeah, you wanted to say something.
Actually, I'm not sure it's covered by the law or not, but I think, according to a law, you can ask the court to recognize someone as your grandfather or great-grandfather, but in practice it's very difficult because as the time past, that you cannot find the evidence. It's very difficult to collect the evidence. So there's not so many cases like that, like the children to ask someone as their grandfather.
Yeah, but it's okay. I mean, we don't expect countries to have laws concerning these cases at the moment because these are just new developments that make it possible to determine lineage up to so many generations. Okay? And it was interesting in the case of Thomas Jefferson because when it became possible to determine the lineage because of genetic testing, someone came up and said, well, let's see if Jefferson really fathered a child by his Negro slave. Okay? And they raised the question, and actually they got their answers. Okay? So the one study came to the conclusion that the simplest and most probable conclusion was that Thomas Jefferson had fathered Easton Hemings, the last-born child of Sally. So they established that he really did father a child by his Negro slave. But it's not as if, I mean, we don't want to destroy the reputation of people here. It was not as if he treated her as a slave and as a sex slave because, as research also showed, he actually was very respectful of her, and he treated her equally, and maybe that was one of the reasons why people suspected that he was having more than a relationship of owner to slave with her. Okay. Now, from genetic testing, this time to research involving mice, involving animals. I wanted to get over with this before we went on to the presentation concerning issues of authorship. Issues of authorship are perhaps one of the most important when we deal with scientific misconduct because all research has to, in order to be respected, end up being published. And so it is in the publication of research results that misconduct becomes apparent. Okay? But we will go to that after this case. So in this particular case, the researcher, Hua, is conducting a study where cancer-prone mice are allowed to develop visible tumors. Okay? The mice are then given experimental drugs, and the effects are observed. Okay? So a simple, up to this point, seemingly a simple experiment involving mice before the experiment could be conducted on human beings. One notices that tumors are interfering, tumors are indeed growing in these experimental mice, but they are not only growing, they're growing so huge that they are interfering with the ability of mice to eat and drink. Okay? Now, some of the mice have been observed to be weaker and more emaciated, thinner, that is, than others, an effect, he thought, of the feeding problems, okay, because the tumors were getting in the way of eating and drinking. According to the protocol he's observing, mice will be treated only if they show obvious signs of pain or discomfort. Do you think Hua should stop the experiment? And if so, on what grounds? Do you see any grounds to stop the experiment? What do you think? Because they are weaker?
The question is, yes, because they are weaker and more emaciate than others. So
If you're using mice in the experiment and your mice could not eat or drink, should you stop the experiment on that basis? I mean, on the basis of the animals being affected? Animal rights, maybe?
Is this symptoms?
Sorry.
The symptoms. The mice become weaker and more,
Yes.
or emaciate is the correct sign?
Yes, emaciated means you're
Yes.
very thin, you're
Yes, very
almost
thin.
just flesh and bone.
Is it normal? Is it right, or is it just maybe something wrong and you should stop the research? This is the symptom that you can expect.
In a society that treats research animals as if they were pets, okay, one couldn't continue a research like this. Well, in the first place, I was actually curious how you would have reacted to a case of this sort. That's why I kept asking, do you see any grounds for stopping the research? Okay, there are very specific rules for research involving animals, and those rules actually tell us that, well, if you're harming the animals so much, then you can't go on with the research. Okay. So that would have been sufficient. But actually, there's another important reason here, a scientific reason. And the scientific reason is that if your mice couldn't eat or drink because the tumors were getting in the way, then the outcome of the research would not be as valid anymore. Because this wouldn't be the ordinary mice anymore. Okay? In other words, if the drugs do not work, it could be because these mice are so thin and unable to drink rather than for another reason. Okay? You get the point? Okay.
Already affect their way to drink, to get food. So this research is not the normal research.
Yes.
Because it's not normal. It's not a normal way to do the research. Is what we
Yeah. Yeah. Later on, if the research were successful, you're going to draw conclusions about whether the drugs will be useful with human beings, right? That's one of the things. I mean, you want to determine if you can move on and do the same research with human beings. So if the drugs are making the tumors smaller, then you say, well, it might work also in human beings, so let's try it on human beings, right? Okay. But if the mice in your research cannot eat anymore, or if they cannot drink properly, then if the drugs do not work, it might be for that reason rather than for the drug itself, right? So you wouldn't want to continue on that basis. And that saves you the trouble of arguing about the interests of the research animals. Okay, but in general, when you use animals for research, there are also some ground rules that you have observed, that you need to observe, and making sure that they are fed properly and are able to drink properly would be one of those rules. Okay, now, okay, we can move on to the issues about authorship. As I said, authorship issues are important because when you do research and report your findings, you report on your publication is supposed to reflect what you have done in your research. Okay? And there are so many questions among people about who to consider as an author, etc. So who is supposed to be an author? Let's start with a basic definition. Is someone who has made substantive intellectual contributions to a published study. Okay? That doesn't tell us very much. But one of the standard bases for determining who has a right to be considered an author would be the ICMJE uniform requirements. Okay? What do I mean by ICMJE? The ICMJE is the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. Okay? The editors of a number of medical journals got together and decided, well, let's come up with these uniform requirements so we can tell prospective authors whether they qualify or not when they submit papers for publication. Okay? And this is further what they said. For someone to be named as a qualified author, he should have participated sufficiently to be publicly responsible for specific parts. And what does that mean? If I show you a paper and I am listed as one of the authors, there should be a part of the paper that I can identify as being something for which I am directly responsible. Okay? And then the requirements also say, if you have qualified authors, all of them must be listed. And there must be a specific author who is to be the guarantor. Guarantor means he is to assume responsibility for the integrity of the whole document. Okay? Meaning, if there are questions, then my email address is there. If you look at the publications, there is named corresponding author. The corresponding author will answer questions. Okay. Now let's look at, again, a case study. This one is about Carlos, who has received a fellowship to conduct research at Professor Dali's laboratory at University B. Okay? By tradition, in this laboratory, they have emphasized group harmony and interdependence. Okay, what does that mean? Well, you'll see what that means. During weekly meetings, the researchers discuss their work and listen to suggestions. Okay, so they have group discussions. And Carlos has learned a lot from those weekly meetings. Okay? Carlos is the fellow who has come to this laboratory to study. Now, Carlos and Dr. Dali worked together on a particular project. And Carlos prepared a draft report and gave it to Eddie to review and modify. Okay. Do you follow the study so far? Okay. When Carlos got the paper back, there were additional names of people listed as authors. There was Alan, there was Betty, and also Eddie. Okay? So Carlos was surprised, and he went to Dr. Dali and asked why the names were added when only he and Dr. Dali had worked on it. Okay? So what did Dr. Dali say? How can you say that? When we did our research, we gained a lot from the input of the other lab members. Alan is working also on a paper about his project. You will review that paper, and you will be listed as a co-author. Do you get his point? Should Carlos accept the other co-authors then? What do you think? Do they have a right to be co-authors? And so that Carlos could be a co-author also on their paper? Isn't that a good way of having a longer list of publications? What do you think? Now, the scientific world is so competitive nowadays, and if you could get your promotions by having a longer list of publications, then this might be a good way, don't you think so? Is this a valid way? What do you think? Is it a good way? Yeah? Why? Why do you say?
In my case, if I'm a graduate student and I write a paper with my supervisor, the professor, and also we have a lot of co-authors. I think I can accept this situation because this paper must not only contribute by myself, but also from, I think, my classmate or the research doing the same project with me.
Yeah, but it's not the same project, remember? It's not the same project that they're working on.
But I think if if we follow the same supervisor, same professor, we must be doing in the same related topic. And through the weekly discussion, as you mentioned, I think I must learn a lot from them as well. So I think.
So you want to recognize their contribution through the discussions, and that is why you will accept their being listed as co-authors in this paper.
Yeah, if I'm a graduate student, but if I'm a PhD student, the situation I think will be different. Because I'm only a graduate student in a master program, I think my own ability, I know my own ability is not strong enough to be like this with my supervisor. But if I'm already a PhD student, I think I have my own ability to write the thesis or a paper to publish. Then if just through the discussion with others, I think I will not accept this kind of situation.
Who thinks differently about this case? Yeah, yes.
I think that according to the first argument, I think it depends on how much of the input is. Because if you say that during a lab meeting, other lab members give you some advice or just question or something, I don't think they are qualified to be a co-author. But if they give you advice and maybe they also did some experiment and that result is significant in that paper, I think I would feel better if they are co-author. And I think that for the second reason, I know that in practice, it's a current practice in scientific papers that, because when we see scientific papers, there are many names in the author column. And I know that their position at the first place, at the last place, or in the middle place, there's some significance. So I don't think that for the second reason, which means that if Carlos accepts others as co-author in exchange of being another co-author, I don't think it's a very good practice, seeing it in the long term, because it's obvious if you are placing in the third or fourth name, everyone knows that you are not the first author. So I mean, it would be better if you are a first author of 2 or 3 papers than if you are a co-author of a lot of papers but never the first author. So I mean, there's some ranking too, and I believe that everyone in the scientific circle knows what the meaning of the ranking is. So if you are a lot of co-authors, it's not. It will not always be good for you.
Yes. Okay. He was saying he wants to acknowledge the contribution of the other staff members to the paper, and that is why he would want to recognize them as co-authors. You're saying, but that should not be automatic just because he contributed. We have to look carefully at the nature of the contribution. One should have contributed in a significant way. In effect, you're saying he must have participated in the experiment in some way to be recognized as an author. Although you realize that maybe that is not actually the practice, because you're seeing papers with many co-authors, and what that tells you is that probably there are many co-authors because some of those authors have not really contributed so significantly to